In our last video, we covered the function for dropping duplicates, and we saw that it was a simple, uh, you know, uh, all we had to do was make a simple call to Pandas inbuilt function. So today we're going to look at something similar, where we have to, instead of dropping rows that have duplicates, we're going to drop rows that have some empty values in them. So as always, first you should open up Anaconda Navigator and then launch Jupyter Lab. Once you have a window like this open, you can either navigate to any notebooks you have already created or create a new one using this tile here by clicking on this tile. So as I said, last time we looked at this drop duplicates functionality, and this was directly taken from the Pandas library. So today we have something similar. We're going to look at this function. We're going to look at this exercise where we're given a table, as always, and notice how there's a special value here called none, right? In the second row. What we have to do is remove any rows that have the value none. So, there are some rows with missing values in the name column. Write a solution to remove the rows with missing values, and our output table should have those rows removed, right? Here we see that the student ID 217 is not included. So I'm going to just run this import cell because I'm opening this after some time. And I'm going to copy some data that I already created, right? And for some of them, I'm going to just write none for two of them. And I'll call this student data instead. Oh, I see what the problem is. We were using a markdown cell. So if I switch back to code, now it lines up properly. So what I basically did was I just copied over the last data that we had. I renamed the variable, so it's a new variable, and I populated some of the names with nones. So we don't have the name available. And notice how the none value lights up. So this is a special, uh, you know, syntax for basically saying we don't have any values. So I'm going to run this now. And as we've seen previously, we have to create our columns before we create the data frame. So the first one will be student ID. The second column is called name. And the third column, they used age, but we'll just use email since that's the data we have. That's great. And now we can create the student data frame. So we just create a variable called students and then use the pandas data frame function to pass in our data as student data and our columns as student data columns. And then we close brackets. Remember, there's a comma here. So if I run student now to see what the table has. We have, our rows. Some of them have a name value of none. And this is what we have to remove. So since, student is of type data frame, if I check the type of student, it's a data frame. We can run this function called drop NA. And similar to this drop duplicates function, it takes in a subset and and you can optionally pass in this in place value in place of true or in place of false, right? So for us, the subset is name, since that's the column we're focusing in on to see, which values in the name column are none. And then I'll just set in place equal to true. I just want to make sure if the P is capital, no. So this is pretty much it. If I run this piece of code, something happened in the background. We're going to check our table, our student table again. Notice how rows, the rows with the student ID 3 and the row with the student ID 5 is missing. That's because using this drop NA function, we filtered it out, right? So I'm going to copy this. And I'll just give you some notes. So instead of drop duplicates, if we want to drop rows that are NA, we simply write drop NA, subset, it's the subset, which is a column you want to drop NA or none for, right? And in place true is optional. It will make sure that the filtering happens on the original table. But what if we have something like this, right? So let's take our student table here again. Let's look at this. We have some nones in the name column, but suppose we also have some nones in the email column, right? Oops. So I'll write none here. I'll write none here. And I'll also write none here. So in essence, we only have 2 complete columns. The remaining 4 columns have some piece of data missing, either in the name column, the email column, or both, which is the case with this 5th row, right? So how do we remove rows that have multiple nones, right? Not just from one column. Well, it's very simple. So I'm going to run the student data again, which updates, everything. So now if I check student, the student table, we have a bunch of nones, we have nones here in the name column and then nones in the email column. And I want to drop all rows that have nones in either the name or email column. So very simply, I can make modifications to the original function. Instead of our subset just being one, string called name, we can make this a list. And in this list, I can pass in the names of all the columns that I want to check for dropping NAs, right? So in this case, our second column is called email. And then I simply just create a list for it. The list contains the names of the columns. So now if I run this and then I check our table, we only have 2 columns, sorry, 2 rows. And these were the 2 complete rows that we initially had, right? Which had no none values for its name and email column. So I'll just make a modification to this. Takes in the subset, uh, can be in the form of a list if you want to pass in multiple columns. If you want to check multiple columns, okay? And similarly, how I used a list for the subset with this drop NA function, you can also use a list for the drop duplicates function, okay? So, if you want to drop duplicates for multiple uh, columns, right? You can just make this a list as well.